bonito esto.
Sí, es muy bonito. Mire, allí vivo yo.
¿Dónde?
A la izquierda de aquella torre grande. Y por allí están los estudios donde trabajo.
Mi casa es más difícil de encontrar. Está en un hondo. ¿Ve usted la torre de San Agustín? Pues cerca de allí. La de Lolita sí que se ve enseguida. Es aquella de ladrillo colorado.
Me gusta ver Madrid desde arriba. Es como si fuera uno el amo de todo.
Cinema, since its earliest days, has devoted significant attention to urban areas and spaces. The city is presented as an environment in which many different stories unfold, but frequently this space transcends the role of mere scenery or a passive backdrop to become a leading protagonist. This narrative and visual relevance has meant that urban structures and morphologies, spatial and functional transformations, contrast between deprived and privileged areas have been captured on camera. Indeed, cinema has been with us for so long that the medium has become geohistorical chronicle, bearing witness to urban spaces which no longer exist, sometimes portraying the different phases of their transfiguration.
Dios mío, parece Sarajevo.
Los van a expropiar, lo van a tirar todo.
¿Así? ¿Cuándo?
No sé, van a construir una avenida muy importante. Príncipe de Asturias, creo que se va a llamar.
Cinema does not limit itself to presenting and describing these spaces. Instead, new points of view have been introduced by directors depicting the city, while on other occasions films have been based on works of literature or even pictorial works of art. Thus, the film Domingo de Carnaval by director Edgar Neville opens and closes with a panoramic view of Madrid from the Pradera de San Isidro, establishing a clear link with the famous painting by Francisco de Goya. The historical evolution of Madrid can be divided into two clearly distinct periods. The first is notable for its long duration, lasting from its Arab origins in the 9th century until the middle of the 19th century, and for its limited spatial growth, a common feature of pre-industrial cities. The second period occupies only the last century and a half, yet during this time the city expanded radically to occupy a far wider surface area and developed into a greater metropolis, one of the largest capital cities in Europe. Underlying this change was a transition from an ancient regime, or old order economy, to an industrial and finally post-industrial one. The revolution of means of transport, both intercity and intra-urban, which took place from the mid-19th century onwards, contributed to the city's remarkable growth.
El día que quiera venderlo se hace rico.
Ahí está la cosa, es que yo no quiero venderlo. No crea que no han venido veces a querer comprármelo para hacer rascacielos, pero yo aquí he vivido y aquí he de morir. Si quieren agrandar la ciudad, que construyan en otra parte sin atropellarme a mí.
As this latter period coincided with the dawn and development of photography and film, cameras inevitably became the watchers of Madrid's spaces and citizens, as well as witnesses of the changes which the city was experiencing. Unlike other cities of contemporary creation, the central areas of Madrid were shaped over centuries which elapsed before the advent of film. So well established were these spaces when cinema emerged that they naturally became the setting for many great films, both Spanish productions and, from the middle of the 20th century, foreign ones. The attraction towards the city's historic centre is owing to various factors. Its irregular layout and old houses inhabited by Madrid's working class, its retail shops and its crowded streets and squares lend themselves to scenographies of interest for certain thematic areas, such as the arrival of immigrants, the housing problem, crime, etc. Firstly, thematic issues. As a great many works from Spanish literary and theatrical tradition and genres, direct adaptations of these works have made the area a popular and outstanding film set. For example, the Rastro area played a vital role in several notable films addressing social and plebeian themes made in the 50s. Secondly, the attraction of Madrid's historical centre can also be explained by its landmarks, immediately recognisable not only by the citizens of Madrid, but also by Spaniards all over the country, and even a good many foreign viewers. Plaza Mayor, Puerta del Sol, Plaza de Cibeles, Puerta de Alcalá, etc. Finally, there is also an aesthetic component in the attention paid to the historical centre by cinema. Therefore, the irregular, winding streets, the mixture of open and narrow spaces typical of the old centres of Spanish cities, are ideal for productions which seek to physically represent the labyrinthine and enigmatic nature of the stories they narrate. This is an adequate setting, for example, for detective films. The historic heart of the city contains an artery of great relevance for both the city itself and cinematographic images, the Gran Via. This great avenue was planned at the turn of the 20th century, and so cinema has witnessed its construction and evolution over the years. Thus the film El Misterio de la Puerta del Sol, released in 1929, includes a series of aerial shots showing the ravages which the opening of such a large avenue as the Gran Via caused in the old town. The Gran Via's modernity offers an interesting contrast to the more traditional buildings adjoining.
10,000 muchachas bonitas en Madrid han florecido. Por calles y plazas reparten banderas, sonríen y cantan. Las chicas de la Cruz Roja, novias de la primavera, abrieron sus corazones cantando, cantando y encuentran amor.
As an indicator of social and economic development, its cinematic popularity was to continue over the following decades. As both cinema and the city developed, other urban morphologies were to come under the spotlight. A significant case is the ensanche, an extension to the city designed to house Madrid's emerging middle class, which began to take shape from 1860. Despite the ample surface area of the new districts, Salamanca, Retiro, Chamberí, Argüelles, Arganzuela, and their financial and social prominence, they are featured on films far less frequently than the Old Town. Perhaps, in contrast to the historic city centre, the monotonous regularity of its grid layout and the lower density of emblematic landmarks, with the exception of those on the edges of the Old Town or along avenues of the Prado, Recoletos, and Castellana, have placed it at a disadvantage. Nonetheless, some films have been set totally or partially within the Madrid ensanche area, which is portrayed as an area of strong economic dynamism, as its architectural features suggest. Some of these movies depict the social characteristics typical of this sector of the city in a humorous tone.
Pues mira, el más hipercanalla de todos los que está diciendo, ¿sabes quién es? ¿Quién? Nosotros.
Something similar has happened with the working-class suburbs, such as Tetuan, Guindalera, Puente de Vallecas, and Usera. Established early in the 20th century on the outskirts of Ensanche, these neighbourhoods sprang up spontaneously and were incorporated into the city later on. Originally lacking town planning and facilities, their urban features are more reminiscent of rural districts than of genuinely urban spaces. Though their development was contemporary with that of cinema, these working-class suburbs are rarely seen in films.
Pues porque no está bien presentarse en casa de la gente así sin avisar, aunque sea tu hermana.
¿Pero qué te ha dado a ti ahora con la Sole?
Es una cuestión de educación, mamá.
Mira, me vais a tocar el fandango tú, tu tía, las dos.
That can also be said of the garden city-style residential areas existing in Madrid. These are small housing developments dotted around the city which follow an Anglo-Saxon urban planning model, combining natural elements with the detached family residences. Some fleeting images of these garden city estates appear in different films. From the mid-50s onwards, Franco's regime addressed the housing problem by constructing council estates, generically known as social housing neighbourhoods, in almost all Spanish cities. These neighbourhoods, originally built on the outskirts of the cities, feature simple designs of low architectural quality and tend to be rather dull to look at. Blocks without interior courtyards containing low-ceilinged flats of limited size. These urban spaces, which came into being to resolve problems such as housing, have been portrayed by Spanish cinema, mostly in films addressing social issues. Some early examples reflecting the influence of Italian neorealism. In more recent times, these areas have served to represent a social class previously little shown on film.
Repito, si no proceden a desalojar el piso, me veré obligado a utilizar otros métodos.
Una calle entera dedicada a los más grandes genios creadores de la historia de la humanidad. Los ACDC. El mejor grupo de rock and roll que ha habido hay y ha.
In more recent times, these areas have served to represent a social class previously little shown on film. Since the mid-70s, in various areas of the city, privately built neighbourhoods have appeared. These districts were designed to meet the needs of a population undergoing strong demographic growth while in possession of greater purchasing power.
Casas en construcción. Montañas de casas en construcción.
These environments abandon the model favoured by the ensanche areas, adopting instead an architecture in which freestanding tower blocks for residential use predominate.
Abuelo, que ya estamos. Un tercero, casi un cuarto. ¿Por qué no mandó el primero?
Si la casa tiene ascensor, padre.
Y cuando se estropee el ascensor, ¿qué hago yo?
Podía usted haberse quedado abajo, así no se habría cansado.
¿Qué luz tiene?
Vaya vistas.
Tercero, derecha.
¿Qué es un cuarto?
Cocina, cuarto de aseo, living, comedor con su terraza, un dormitorio, otro dormitorio y otro dormitorio.
Este es el mío.
Bueno,
sí.
¿Qué te parece?
Estupendo.
This type of urban planning coincided with policies of economic development and with private vehicles as the most widespread means of transport. The growth of the city over those decades was accompanied by the construction of modern transport infrastructures, which interconnect and direct the flow of people and vehicles towards the city and within it. An example of this is a flyover, popularly known at the time as Skeletrix. Symbols of the modernity of the era, flyovers help to achieve an almost constant flow of traffic by avoiding those annoying waits for vehicles at traffic lights. For later generations of Madrid's residents, a new style of town planning placing greater emphasis on pedestrians' needs has erased the image of these landscapes, damaging structures. This same pretension to modernity is also reflected in film shots, featuring high-capacity roads like the M30 motorway or the highways leading into the city, and particular attention is paid to the road linking Madrid with its airport, Barajas. Thus, cinema began to provide testimony, albeit partial and biased, about the important roles played by different areas of Madrid: Old Town, Ensanche, suburbs and peripheral neighbourhoods, as these gained in relevance. On these maps we can see the way shooting locations gradually moved away from the centre towards the outlying districts. While the preeminent space in Domingo de Carnaval is the Rastro, by the end of the 50s the recently completed Gran Via was attaining clear visual predominance. This pattern was consolidated in the 70s, though complemented by forays into areas like Puente de los Franceses or the Almudena Cemetery. During the 80s and 90s, other areas were added, such as Plaza de Castilla, the suburb of Tetuan, and so forth. On the other hand, some important neighbourhoods like Chamberí and Arganzuela enjoyed far less representation. Like other Western cities, Madrid has witnessed the incorporation of new filming spaces, a process which coincided with the introduction of new cinematic languages. Thus, without losing their privileged status, the iconic spaces began to share the limelight with other, less recognizable areas. In the case of Spain, this change was marked by a political transition. The end of Franco's regime and the introduction of democracy favored the appearance of new directors and new stories which focused on outlying neighborhoods, revealing the existence of another Madrid, different from the one shown by official cinema under Franco. From the 80s onwards, we find films which seek to portray a series of social contrasts, which are also perceptible as such from the perspective of town planning. Although many Spanish filmmakers have shown the progressive expansion of the city towards the periphery, the centre is still a location which crops up repeatedly in a great many Spanish films. Viewed from a temporal perspective, a recurring attention, gravitation towards certain spaces in the city can be perceived. These spaces are presented as iconic itineraries, as though they were postcards, exerting unquestionable touristic appeal.
La esencia pura de un documental urbano en una serie de encuadres que luego no resultaron demasiado de tarjeta postal.
This tendency is, if possible, even more marked in the case of foreign productions which restrict themselves to portraying emblematic spots uniquely. Fixation with the landmarks of the city sometimes leads to the deliberate omission of non-emblematic parts of the real space. By using this kind of spatial ellipsis, the image of the urban reality is changed, and this fosters the creation of a Madrid which in the end only exists on film.